Okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to today's webinar called Privacy 101, hosted by Susie and Monifa from Garabyte. Thank you both for joining us so much. Just some housekeeping things before I give an introduction. We're going to do some Q&A, so feel free to drop any of your questions into the chat and I'll present them to Susie and Monifa and we can address questions as we're kind of a smaller group today. If you have anything post, say you get the recording and you have some questions, feel free to shoot them off. We'll connect you where that goes. And with that, don't worry about trying to keep all the information. We're going to send you a recording of today's session so that you can review and learn further. So to give you just a little bit of an introduction to Garabyte. So Garabyte is a boutique data privacy consultancy founded by Monifa and Susie here, with the vision of using their privacy expertise to help organizations build programs and processes that protect personal information. They help companies to understand and to comply with their regulatory requirements while leveraging data privacy to support innovation. And Susie and Monifa are both very experienced. So Susie's driven by finding innovative ways to ensure organizations meet the regulatory and compliance requirements while maximizing the value of data. For more than 2 decades, she's supported organizations as they navigate the intersection between privacy, technology, regulation, and public policy. And Monifa has also spent nearly 2 decades developing skills in data privacy, regulatory compliance, risk management, and process improvement. Her diverse background and range of skills have honed her ability to provide practical guidance to help organizations operationalize privacy. So without further ado, let me pass it off to Monifa and Susie. Monifa will start presenting.
Thank you so much, Katie. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We are excited to talk to you today about Privacy 101. So just as a quick overview, we're going to go through a high-level introduction, cover some privacy basics. We'll talk about privacy program development as well as privacy in the workplace. And then our wrap-up will include Q&A. Please feel comfortable asking questions as we're going along. We want to make sure that the session is as interactive as possible. So if you have questions, just raise your hand and jump in. So kind of as Katie mentioned up top, Susie and I formed together to be Garabyte. Part of our work really is helping companies understand and operationalize their privacy requirements. It's important to us that we aren't just providing a bunch of policies and procedures that are collecting dust. We want to make sure that they become living, breathing parts of the organization. So we work to draft or update policies as well as procedures. We handle breach notification and reporting. We do privacy impact assessments and vendor compliance assessments as well. We deliver privacy training and work on different awareness strategies as well to ensure that best practices become embedded within the organization. We also support in-house privacy offices and privacy teams with any ad hoc support that they may need. One of the things that we see a lot in our organizations is that privacy doesn't always get the funding and resources or the support that it needs. And that's where we're able to step in and provide that ad hoc support to continue to deliver on the privacy program. And then we also support from a public policy development standpoint. So we're able to have conversations and develop what the public policy positions should be. So I won't go back over this because Katie did a great job with our intros up front. So I will turn it over to Susie.
Thanks, Monifa. Great to see everyone. Thank you for giving us your lunch hour. We're always excited to talk to people about privacy because that's what we do. So just quickly, some privacy basics. It used to be when you talked about privacy, people would say, I have nothing to hide, so I'm not worried about privacy. But things have really moved on, and I haven't heard anyone say that in a long, long time. I think everyone, from our children to grandparents, really are a lot more aware of privacy. And I think that's a large part because we live so much of our lives online. So to level set, what are we talking about when it comes to personal information? I think people know the basics that, it's your date of birth, but often when you dig into it, personal information can be a lot broader than what people assume. So it's things like, national identification numbers, passport details, political views, religion, opinions. It can be pictures of yourself, pictures of your kids that you post online. Another aspect of personal information that we're doing a lot more work on is biometric information, because you're seeing that collected in a lot more places. So really the best way to think about personal information is any information that identifies who you are. And personal information doesn't need to be private. It doesn't mean it's private. I think that's also an area that people get confused upon. Well, some information you should be keeping private, like your passport number. Other personal information is very public. My name, my face, the city I live in. I'm in Toronto today. So I think, that's a key thing to understand, that personal information doesn't need to be private, and a lot of it isn't. And so when we talk about privacy, there are obviously different aspects of it. There's, your privacy as a citizen, as a consumer, as an employee. But today we're really focusing on privacy in the lens of business owners. Most of you are from law firms. So, as someone that's operating a business, what do you need to think about when it comes to privacy? So moving on, just sort of building on privacy basics, why is privacy important? I think everyone knows it is because they read the headlines in the news and they see about privacy breaches. But I think as someone that is responsible for, an organization, it's very key that you understand how you're using, collecting, sharing personal information as it relates to your employees, your clients, customers, any information that comes under your purview. And really, the basic thing when it comes to privacy is ensuring that that personal information is protected and secured, and that you are managing it and processing in a way that is consistent with the privacy policy posted on your website, and also in line with the expectations of the individual whose data you're collecting, and also the laws that you're subject to. So for example, we're based here in Canada. There are Canadian privacy laws that protect Canadian information. In the States, there's, a bit of a patchwork approach, where you have California governing privacy of personal information in one way, and, various laws across states to govern how data is collected in those jurisdictions. So, building on that, I think the key aspects of why privacy is important for an organization: reputation. People are not going to want to do business with an organization who has maybe been plastered all over the front pages of media because they've had privacy breaches. So, reputation is very important in this day and age where people have so much choice and we live in a very competitive market. Building on that trust. People want to know that the organizations they're sharing their data with, that they can trust them. And I think that goes for both, employees and consumers. Employees want to know that their employer is taking care of, their payroll data or, relevant health information. And all of this leads to the bottom line. I think ultimately, that's what most organizations are focused on. And so you want to do everything to contribute to a successful bottom line, and having strong privacy protections in place help contribute to that. Operations, a well-functioning, well-oiled machine includes having an effective privacy program. And, I don't know what organization doesn't want to operate efficiently. Regulatory consequences. And I think this, feeds into the headline. Certain jurisdictions have huge financial penalties for for organizations that don't meet their privacy compliance requirements. I think this really kicked off in Europe with the GDPR, which was implemented in 2018, where there are eye-watering fines for privacy breaches. So, you don't want to be on the wrong side of the regulator. And then if you're a publicly traded company, obviously investor confidence feeds into that. So I think, when you look at privacy, there are so many different layers and levels for why having a well-functioning and effective privacy program is important. And I think another thing we're seeing is in absence of clear regulations, in Canada right now, they've been trying to update our private sector privacy legislation for a long time. And when you're sort of operating in this gray area, to have defensibility and have evidence to demonstrate what actions you've taken to meet your compliance requirements or to operate an effective program, I think is a really useful step. And so, if the regulator comes knocking and questions something, you have this sort of paper trail to demonstrate what you have done to be on the right side of protecting your organization's personal information. So moving on, a question that we're often asked about, or we find it can be, a misunderstood area is, well, I have a cybersecurity program. I don't need a privacy program. And maybe that's true. Maybe your cybersecurity program addresses privacy, but that's not always the case. And so this is something we like to talk to people about, just to sort of level set and educate on what's the difference between data privacy and data security. And so the way I like to talk about it is, they're siblings. Privacy and security sit alongside each other, and sometimes they get along, sometimes they don't, but they definitely need each other and they're definitely interrelated. So from a privacy perspective, or the way we talk about it is, we're sort of the governance, policy, procedures sort of side of the shop. And also privacy is concerned with things that are online and offline. So, a notebook, a filing cabinet, and that's stuff that the cybersecurity people never really touch on because they're all focused on sort of the online and digital side of things. So building on that, privacy is about the rules, the frameworks and guidelines that speak to how personal information is processed, and that's how it's collected, who it's shared with. And this is what's sort of contained in policies, procedures, and operational guidelines. And privacy programs tend to focus on principles, and there are 10 key privacy principles. I won't go through them in detail, but that really help direct how an organization manages personal information. And some of these principles include things like accountability. Does an organization have a chief privacy officer or someone in charge of privacy? Can an organization demonstrate that it is accountable for the personal information under its control? Another key privacy principle that we talk about a lot is data minimization. So are you collecting the right amount of data you need for a specified purpose? Are you over collecting information? So as an example, I've used this before, so apologies if anyone's already heard this example, checking into a hotel, and I had registered, they had my credit card, and then they asked for my driver's license, and I pulled it out and I showed it to them. And then they wanted to photocopy it. And I was a bit taken aback because, I was happy for them to visually verify who I was, but there was absolutely no purpose for them to photocopy my identification. So, of course, being a privacy nerd, I wanted to cite data minimization, and there was no need to collect that information. I refrained, but that's just a perfect example of maybe sometimes where organizations aren't fully aware and how times have changed, because in the past I would have given my driver's license to be photocopied, and I know I have. So I think going back to comparing or seeing how privacy and security sit, when you think about cybersecurity, and I don't know if we have any cybersecurity experts on the call, so I'm not going into an area that I proclaim to be an expert on, but cybersecurity is really around securing information, securing data. And it's not just about securing personal information. It can be about securing commercially sensitive information, confidential information within an organization. So it extends much beyond personal information. And data security, cybersecurity is a key partner to privacy because it really helps keep that personal information secure. And this is important now more than ever in the age of cyber warfare, where, it's not a case of if you're going to have a cyber attack, It's when you're going to have a cyber attack. So ensuring that the organization has the right access controls and security measures in place. So really, I like to see it, and I think this graphic, explains it well. Data security is about the lock. Data privacy is about policies, procedures, processes around the personal information, which is one subset of the data that data security is focused on. So I'm going to hand over to Monifa now to talk about how you build a privacy program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susie. This is a great place to start. So as soon as Susie kind of alluded to before, there are usually generally accepted privacy principles, and it kind of is neutral regardless of where you're operating in the world. I mean, there are different laws and regulations that govern each jurisdiction. Some are more prescriptive than others, and some are more principle-based. But at its core, and at all of their core, usually sits the general privacy principles that will allow you to build an effective privacy program that can mature depending and grow with the organization. So what we have prepared for our clients is kind of a roadmap that talks about, what are the components of a privacy program that you should have as you're evolving. So when we think about the generally accepted privacy principles, and I won't dive super deep into all of them, what I will do is kind of focus on some key areas that organizations should think about embedding. But when we look at the principles, there is management and accountability. There is notice, there is choice and consent, thinking about the collection of information, use, retention, and disposal of that information, access and granting access to information, disclosure to third parties and sharing of data, security for personal information, quality and maintaining accurate information, as well as monitoring and enforcement. So all of those components are really what you need to bring together to make an effective privacy program. And depending on the size of your organization, the type of personal information that you're processing, where you're operating in the world, that's what will kind of determine exactly what components of those principles you need to bring together as your organization is scaling and growing. So we normally recommend for smaller organizations or startups is really just understanding the privacy laws and regulations, having a data inventory, and then having a public-facing privacy policy. As the organization is growing, you want to build on that and think about breach response planning, having consent management, education and awareness for employees, and then having internal policies and procedures that start to mirror and operationalize what has already been published publicly. And as the organization continues to grow, that's when you really want to think about how are you engaging your vendors? Are you engaging with them in a way that mirrors what you have stated in your privacy policy about how you're protecting personal information? You want to make sure that you have a robust way of operationalizing privacy rights, have some data governance strategies around how you are treating personal information as it moves throughout your organization, and then also have a more in-depth privacy training for your employees so that you're plugging all the holes. It's something that we say on both the privacy as well as the security side is at the end of the day, your first line of defense is your team, it's your employees. So no matter what systems you put in place from a privacy or security perspective, they're only as effective as the training that you provide for your staff. When we look at, the largest of the organizations, in addition to all the other steps, that's when you want to look at making sure that you actually have somebody who's named as accountable. So your chief privacy officer, having a full implemented privacy management program and a privacy risk management. Some terms that you might hear a lot in the privacy space are terms like privacy by design. And that's not only thinking about the principles, but thinking about how do you embed those principles throughout the life cycle of data within your organization as part of your marketing, as part of your security, as part of your customer service. How are you ensuring that privacy controls have been embedded at every step to protect that information? So when I think about a few of the building blocks that really bring privacy together, the very first thing I would recommend for any organization is having data mapping. When we think about your data mapping, it's something that will help an organization prepare for a data breach by providing a clear overview of where personal data is stored, how it flows through your organization. It ensures that, whoever is supporting privacy within the company knows exactly where the affected data is, how to assess the risks. It can ensure compliance with different regulations depending on where you operate, and it also helps to better streamline your incident response. Most importantly, a data map just lets you know what you're collecting. Often as Susie and I engage with organizations, they think they have an idea of what data they're processing, but as we start working on data mapping for them, they identify that they're actually collecting or processing a lot more information than they initially thought. In addition to just helping you have a clear picture of your personal information that's being processed, I would say one of the key reasons this matters is that during an incident, every single second counts. And if you are using that time during an incident to just now start figuring out, what do we have? Where do we have it? Who are we sharing it with? That's time that's impacting your ability to correct the situation, as well as get your business back up and operational. So it's much easier to figure this out up front and weave it into, and maintaining it into how you operate on a regular basis than trying to figure that out in a moment of crisis. So this is something that Susie had touched on before as well, but really understanding your regulatory requirements. So once you know the data that your organization is processing, it is so important to understand the regulations that apply to you. Your privacy regulations go so far beyond just where your organization sits. As Susie mentioned, it also now takes into account where do the individuals that you are collecting or processing data from, where do they sit? So, you could be a company that is based in Canada or the United States, but if you're processing personal information for somebody in Europe, you now also have to take those regulations into account. If your organization sits in California, but you are also processing personal information for someone in Canada, you're processing personal information for someone in Oregon, there are different laws that will apply. There are also different penalties that will apply if you are not aligned with the regulations. And although the generally accepted privacy principles are a great start when building your privacy program, each of these regulations also has their own nuances in regards to what are the additional criteria that you have to comply with. As an example, if we're looking at California regulations, there are very strict requirements about not processing personal information for secondary uses and having the ability to opt out of those things and how they have to be displayed on a company website, as an example. So if you're doing business with organizations that operate in California, you might see a lot of do not sell or do not share buttons on the homepage of their screen, depending on the type of activity that they participate in, because that's what will also determine, what you have to post when and why. So these are some of the key things to know is that if you don't know what laws apply to you, you don't know what additional requirements and obligations you need to meet, which means that you could, without intention, end up being subject to some pretty steep fines, simply because you weren't aware that these were additional obligations that you had. When we look at the Canadian landscape, depending on where you sit in Canada, not only do we have federal obligations that apply, so we have our Privacy Act, which is for our government institutions. We also have the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, PIPEDA, which applies to private sector and federally regulated businesses. That regulation may or may not change depending on what happens with our elections. But then we also have provincial regulations. So each province and territory in Canada has its own privacy legislation and oversight authority. Some of these laws have been deemed to be substantially similar to PIPEDA, which means that they would apply instead of PIPEDA. This is the case in Alberta, British Columbia, and Quebec. Quebec now has the most up-to-date privacy regulations in Canada, and they are very similar to the GDPR. For anyone who is conducting business that includes personal information of Quebec residents, they have additional requirements, like things like conducting privacy impact assessments. If you're going to be processing personal information with new technology, that is a requirement. That is not something that we have anywhere else in the Canadian privacy landscape. So it's definitely key to know the laws that apply. Once you know the laws and you know what personal information you have, you've got to start building out your policy and procedure suite. So when we think about these policies and procedures, not only do you need to have something that is public facing on your website, which will speak to your clients and anyone who is using your products or services, but then you need to have policies and procedures inside that tell your employees what they need to do to comply with how your organization manages personal information. Although this is usually the piece that a lot of organizations skip, it's one of the pieces, again, everything in privacy is super important, but if you're going to do anything, make sure that you have clear policies and procedures internally that give you a paper trail and at least some demonstration of due diligence in the event of an investigation. A couple examples I'll provide is that anyone who was subject to the Desjardins breach a few years ago, coming out of that, their investigation identified that Desjardins, although these cyber incidents are frequent and can happen to any organization, regardless of what you do, they were found to be negligent because of the fact that they lacked when it came to accountability, retention periods, and security safeguards. They also lacked privacy training. They didn't have proper internal controls when it came to their policies and procedures, and they didn't have any embedded governance structure that spoke to how things needed to be handled. So when you think about having your internal policies and procedures, you really want to make sure that you have clear documentation that's easily accessible for your employees and that your employees are trained on what these things actually mean. Vendor management is also another key piece. When you're using vendors or suppliers to help you process personal information, assessing their privacy posture is crucial to how your organization is processing personal information. You want to ensure that they have robust privacy practices and procedures to help mitigate the risk of data breaches and ensure compliance with your regulations. So although they are a completely separate organization, when you're engaging them to process personal information on your behalf, they essentially become an extension of your business. And that's anybody, whether it's your accountant that you're working with, it could be somebody who's doing marketing on your behalf, could be a healthcare provider, anyone who is processing personal information on behalf of your organization is now going to be, or should be anyways, scrutinized in regards to how they are processing personal information. Because if one of those vendors has an incident that impacts the data that they were processing for you, at the end of the day, the headline is not going to be the name of the sub-processor that had the breach or who was impacted. The name that's going to make the headline is the main organization. So, your organization will end up being the headline and speaking to the fact that there was an incident impacting the data that you process. And I know I touched on this before, but I can't seem to emphasize this enough. Training and awareness is key. Providing privacy training and awareness is crucial because it equips your employees with the knowledge to identify and respond to incidents. Well-trained staff can recognize potential threats, they follow proper protocols, and they minimize the impact of any breaches. because your employees and your team are going to be your first line of defense, you want to make sure that they are comfortable in understanding the information, that they know how to alert if they identify anything is wrong or seems strange. We see phishing attempts all the time, and it's so important that employees are trained on how to identify those things. But in addition to that, it's not just understanding what to be aware of when we think about the digital space. You want to make sure that they understand what privacy means outside of that digital space as well, so that they are protecting information regardless of its format. And then lastly, I'll say that when you're thinking about how do you tie this all in together, and you want to bring it together in an incident response playbook. Ultimately, there are two reasons for having a great privacy program. One is to make sure that you are treating personal information correctly throughout its life cycle in your organization. But the other is to make sure that you have a robust system to keep you insulated and protect against breaches. In order for you to make sure that if you have an incident, you know how to respond to it correctly, you want to have an incident response playbook, which kind of speaks to some of the other things that we talked about before, like having training and understanding your data inventory. With your incident response playbook, you're going to be bringing everything together. So you're going to identify, who are the points of contact if something happens. And that will include everything from, who's your legal counsel, who's your insurance provider, who is accountable from a privacy perspective, who in your operations should be notified. So you want to have a very clearly laid out map of who are all those key stakeholders who should be a part of that conversation, including your communications team, as you think about how you're going to notify impacted individuals, and any messaging that might need to be provided internally to your staff as well. When you think about your incident response playbook, it's what's going to help minimize your downtime by simply having very clear procedures as to, if this happens, this is who you contact, these are the steps you take, this is what resolving the issue looks like, this is how we assess if there was something that requires reporting to a regulator, not reporting to a regulator, do we have to notify impacted individuals, not notify impacted individuals, that kind of thing. So having that incident response playbook and doing practice with that at least once a year, and keeping it up to date to make sure that the stakeholders that are identified are still with your organization, and identify anything that needs to be changed or updated. It's something that saves a lot of time and money in the event of a breach. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Susie, and we'll talk about privacy in the workplace.
Thanks, Monifa. So as Monifa touched on, the first line of defense, employees, empowering them so they can help and be your privacy champions is a really important aspect of the role an employee plays. But also there's the aspect of how, as an employer, that you manage the privacy of your employees. And increasingly, and I don't know if this can all be attributed to, the pandemic and people working from home, but there are a lot more privacy invasive technologies available for employers to use, from sort of GPS fleet tracking to app-based, location-based monitoring to key log stroking to, knowing how long people are, using Outlook, like the number of tools that are available for employers to measure productivity and ensure engagement are available. And, some of them have very practical application. But I think, as an employer, you need to be mindful of how you present these tools, if they're, legal in your jurisdiction, and how they're managed. Because I think, no employee wants to feel that they are being, spied upon. So protecting employee personal information is multi-faceted. And I think building on what Monifa was saying about having sort of that data map, increasingly it's important for employers to understand all the points of collection they have on employees. And this almost starts from before someone becomes an employee. The recruitment and onboarding process, is a time when employers are potentially collecting a great deal of personal information of those people that they're recruiting, and then eventually, are they being hired? And if they're not being hired, how is that personal information, stored of those who unsuccessful candidates, making sure you've got a retention or a destruction policy in place, because, if you haven't hired someone, you have their resume on file for a year or two, what's the purpose of that? So I think as an employer, it's, incumbent on you to meet the regulatory requirements, but also potentially sort of brand and ethics. How do you want to be seen as an employer, and how you manage your employee information? Because, I think some employers want to do the right thing, and they want to ensure that their employees are comfortable with how their personal information is being managed. So, how can you do that? Well, obviously, there are the technical safeguards that we've spoken to, but making sure that there are access controls in place to ensure that not everyone in an organization can access the HR files, where maybe someone's performance review or an incident report of, a complaint against an employee is stored, because unauthorized access to that, when someone who doesn't have a purpose to access that accesses it, that potentially can constitute a reportable breach in some jurisdictions. So that's an important consideration for employees, as well as, physical safeguards. So, ensuring that only the people who need access to the server room, have access to that, having the right security clearance in place, ensuring that visitors are registered in the right place. A big one during the pandemic, at least in Canada, was around COVID vaccinations and all that information that required a lot of privacy thought to make sure that, the right considerations and the right balance was put in place around respecting employees' privacy, but also, providing a secure workplace. Not a secure workplace, but, there was, a lot of conversation around that, and a lot of organizations were doing privacy impact assessments and providing, notice and transparency to ensure employees were aware of how that their information was being managed. And I think, that comes back to some of the other technology I was talking about at the beginning around sort of tracking, fleet monitoring. It's always important for employers to have a very specific purpose, defined purpose. So, fleet tracking, we're tracking the fleet because that helps with the efficiencies of planning out, where technicians are being deployed, and ensuring that information, if you said that's how the information is being used, ensuring it's only used for that purpose. Because if HR comes knocking and saying, we want to use this information to track engagement and make sure people said they were, working when they were, if HR start to use that information and employees haven't been, informed of that, that's, potentially an issue and something you need to be mindful of. So that's another important consideration, is using the information in a way that employees expect and have been provided notice on. And this is also important, I don't know if it's relevant for this audience, in unionized workforces and workplaces. Unions have different, requirements, and it's making sure as an organization that you're fully aware and on board and operating within, the confines of what your employee rights are. So I think, the key takeaway on this one is always limit the collection of information, be it customer or employee information, for what's required for the intended purpose, and not over collecting, and ensuring you've got the right retention and destruction policies in place. There's nothing worse than, an employee departed and your retention policy is, we're going to keep their file for 3 years, and then all of a sudden you find you've got 10 years worth of data. That leaves you at significant risk should there be a breach. So I think that's sort of high-level overview on privacy in the workplace. And I think that takes us to key takeaways. Monifa, hand over to you to run through the key takeaways.
Thank you so much, Susie. So as Susie mentioned, like that really wraps it up. So key takeaways, know what personal information you have. That is really the starting point. All these regulations only apply if you are processing personal information. So know what you're processing, whether that is related to the clients that you're supporting or to your employees. Know what you have and where you have it. Understand the laws and regulations that apply to you. Once you have the clearest picture of what personal information you have and where you have it, then you can take that step back and take a look at what are the laws that you need to comply with and start taking a look at what are the nuances about each of those laws, as well as what are some of the penalties that could be associated with any of those regulations, so you understand what your risks and area of exposure are. Educate yourself and your employees. It's important that you as an organization, in terms of your leadership team, as well as your employees, understand the importance, as well as what does it mean specifically for your own role. So what does that privacy compliance look like if I am the customer service agent versus if I am the CEO? What does it mean for me in how I execute my day-to-day responsibilities? Seek support where needed. There can be a lot to do when it comes to not only understanding the laws and regulations, but also then operationalizing what compliance looks like within the organization. So it's important to seek support where you need it, whether it's with your policies and procedures, or how do you build and operationalize data classification or your retention schedules. Just trying to figure out what does that look like within your own organization, and how do you get adoption and buy-in from your staff and your team. Think about the worst case scenarios. We have all read various different headlines about privacy breaches and incidents. So it's really important to plan for what does that mean if your organization ends up being impacted, whether you have a cyber breach or you have some other type of breach of physical safeguards, right? Like, what does it mean for you as an organization in terms of the impact to your business, the impact to your clients, and how do you move beyond that type of incident? So having a playbook and some documented policies and procedures to make sure that if the worst case scenario does happen, you're able to bounce back quickly. And then most importantly, I would say protect personal information. Protect the information of your customers and your employees. So have some really resilient safeguards in place so that you know and you can feel confident that you've done everything possible to protect that information. And with that, we'll open it up to questions.
Quiet group today.
We'll let people have a second, but I just want to thank you both so much for the presentation. I found it really informative. I hope everyone else did too. And again, if you have any questions, you can just go drop them in the Q&A, or if you're feeling like you want to review the information and then have some questions, we will be sending a recording of this presentation out.
Yeah, and Katie, just to let your participants know, we have a website. We're available to have one-to-one conversations with anyone that would like to follow up. We know sometimes people don't like to talk about their privacy issues in public. So absolutely reach out to Monifa and I. We'd be, very happy to have a conversation. We've just listed some resources here, and it's more Canadian focused, although the Future of Privacy Forum is a DC based privacy think tank, and they do amazing work. So, these are some available resources.
Well, I'll toss out a question. One that I hear quite often whenever we do these presentations is, can I copy a privacy policy I have seen publicly that is kind of like in my industry? What are your thoughts, Susie?
What are my thoughts? Well, I think you would know my answer to that. Cookie cutter, cut and paste are never ideal because we've come across situations where an organization's actually done that. And once we dig into it, it doesn't reflect how they're actually processing personal information. So it can be very tempting and feel like an efficient way to do something, but not always best practice, because if you have a breach and you have to report something, that's the first place the regulator is probably going to go.
That's a great point. And I think one of the things that most companies overlook when they are taking the cookie cutter approach is that privacy shouldn't be a checkbox exercise. What privacy looks like and what your controls look like really is unique to your business, simply because even if you're operating in the same industry, no two businesses are protecting personal information the same way. They're not processing personal information the same way. They don't have the same use cases. So you want to make sure that even if you are using a framework that you've seen online, that you are taking the time to personalize that for your organization and really understand what it means for your company and have a privacy policy that truly reflects that. There
And I
is
think
nothing worse. Yeah. I was going to say there's nothing worse than having an investigator come in and look at your privacy policy, then look at what's actually happening under the hood and identifying that those two things are not the same at all.
Yeah, I think you raise a good point, and it reminds me of when we were developing the Garabyte privacy policy. I guess 2 points on this. One, developing a privacy policy does not need to be expensive. You work for law firms. It's something that can be done very cost effectively. But when we were developing our privacy policy, the issue of analytics came up. I don't know, Monifa, if you want to speak to what we did on that front.
Absolutely. And, most organizations, like, when you go on their website, they are doing some form of analytics through cookies or beacons or any other type of tracking technology. And although a lot of organizations, that is like boilerplate language within their privacy policies, we realize that, we actually don't have any purpose to be tracking or using any type of cookies or anything like that. So for us, it was really simple because we're not doing it. So our privacy policy states the fact that it's not something that we're participating in. So there's no need to, have a section dedicated to cookies or any other type of tracking. But it is something that's quite common on a lot of websites because it's something that they're doing. Or often cases, again, maybe they're not even doing, they don't have any cookies or anything, but because they have copied and pasted a policy, it now says this is something that they're doing.
So it doesn't look like there are any questions. I don't know, Katie, if we should wrap it up.
Yeah, I think that was really great. Also, your discussion was really interesting. So we'll wrap up today's session. I don't know if you guys have any closing remarks you'd like to say, or
Just thank you, and always be privacy aware.
Thank you so much for joining today.
okay. Thank you both so much. Bye, everyone.